Hello and welcome to another video. In this video we will be talking about my favorite plant, which is the Philodendron Verrucosum, and this is the plant that has sort of started me on my indoor rare plant journey, and is also the biggest brat of a plant I have ever grown. So it's taken me a very long time to understand this plant, and in today's video I will show you all of the things that I've learned, mistakes I've made, and how to best care for this fussy little thing. So let's get into today's video. So firstly, just a bit of a backstory with this plant, and feel free to skip this part if you want. However, I do think it's super important when watching a plant care video that the person you're watching explains how long they've had the plant and possible issues they have overcome. And trust me, I definitely be knowing what this plant likes and dislikes. So I purchased this plant back in 2021, and at the time it looked like this. I always start my plants off as either seedlings, cuttings, or I grow from a seed, and for two reasons. First, it's fun, obviously, seeing how big they can get in your care, and secondly, when you have a really small plant, it gets accustomed to your household conditions. So if you buy a more established plant from someone or a nursery, it may not like the conditions that you grow it in, and it's really just depressing seeing a bigger plant die or just really struggle in the environment that you're providing. So anyway, 5 months it looked like this, and I put it on a moss pole soon after buying because it's the best way to size up your leaves. And then soon after I moved house, and it really struggled with the transition because it's just a very fussy plant. And I decided at that point to just focus on propagating, and I was selling some cuttings here and there. And I very quickly realized how little resilience this plant has. I lost a lot of cuttings, and it actually ended up becoming one of those plants I disliked, and I was kind of scared of it because it just kept dying on me. I separated a few cuttings into different plants, and I experimented with different lighting conditions, and I did find that with really bright light it produces multiple growth points like crazy. So on the stem of a verrucosum you can always see the spot where new growth will come from, and it's quite obvious compared to some other houseplants. So with really strong light, it activates all of the spots on the stem, and there are a couple of downsides with this. With bright light, you don't get those really nice deep green leaves that a verrucosum has, which are, in my opinion, what makes it really, really beautiful. And the second is it's focusing on pushing out all this new growth instead of focusing on just a top leaf growing. So the size of the leaves aren't sort of as big as they can potentially be. Anyway, once I worked out its conditions, I decided to grow the plant without propagating, and I'm just focusing on getting the leaves as big as I can. So as you can see on the moss pole, it's sized up quite a bit from the cutting that I have started at the bottom of the pole. So now let's talk about how to care for this plant. And as I mentioned earlier, if you keep this plant in a really bright area, it will produce a lot of growth from the growth points lower down on the stem. However, if you want this plant to continue to get really big and also have a really nice deep green color to the leaves, then you need to try and mimic its natural environment. And the lighting choice that I would pick for this plant is more of a medium sunlight. And the way that I grow this plant is actually in a bright sunny spot, but I just sort of hide it a little bit behind some other plants. And this is because in its natural environment it grows on a forest floor. So as you can imagine, it's still receiving bright sunlight sometimes, but it's getting more of a broken sunlight living amongst other plants. Soil is very important for this plant as the roots are very fine and can be prone to root rot. The soil that you want to use will be a well-draining mix like a Aroid mix. The plant is a climbing plant, so you'll definitely want to use a moss pole to help it climb and also increase the aerial root growth. So on my plant next to me right now, there is actually none of the plant in the pot at the base. There may be some roots that have sort of traveled down from the moss pole, but I haven't actually planted any of the stem into the pot. So in a way, the soil doesn't really matter as long as its root system is inside of your moss pole. Any plant on a moss pole needs to have a pot at the bottom with a chunky, well-draining soil, because when you are watering your moss pole, it's going to be completely saturated, and if there is any potential roots at the base of the pot, they won't be sitting in a dense soil mix and having the opportunity to rot. If you are starting off your plant and giving it a moss pole and most of its roots are in the pot, just ensure that you're using a soil that is well draining, and you shouldn't really have a problem at all. When watering this plant, if you have it on a moss pole especially, you want to ensure that the plant is not drying out. Water is super important for this plant, but it is mainly for aesthetic reasons, as it's quite responsive to over and under watering. If it's receiving too little water, you will notice on the edges of the leaf that they will start to brown. And I do think to an extent that this is sort of inevitable, but you can definitely decrease the amount of browning by making sure that your moss pole is not completely drying out. So having an enclosed moss pole like the one that I'm using here really helps a great deal to stop this issue. If you are overwatering this plant, then the leaves will turn yellow pretty quickly, and it will always start with the lower leaves, so it's important to keep an eye on the leaves further down on the moss pole for any signs of watering issues. The way that I'm watering this plant is usually once a week, and I'm fertilizing at each watering. I do find in the warmer months I may every now and then add in an extra water between that sort of weekly watering. The great thing about a verrucosum is it is a little bit dramatic when it is thirsty, so you'll notice that the leaves will start to sort of droop a little bit, and I do kind of like when plants are a little bit dramatic like that because it's easy to know when they are thirsty. When I first purchased this plant, I researched a lot on how to grow it, and I did read a few times that the plant prefers a sort of lower temperature to thrive, and I kept to that very strictly at the time, and honestly, looking back on it now, I don't think it makes a huge deal. I've had this plant growing in 3 different houses now, and some of the areas that it has grown in were, I guess, unbearably hot, and it survived just fine. There was no signs of distress. But just remembering I have grown this plant from a small cutting, so it's become acclimatized to my household conditions. If you purchase this plant and it's a little bit more of a mature plant, if possible, ask the person or the nursery that you have purchased it from what conditions they are growing it in, and do your best to mimic that. Otherwise, just place it in your house and try to grow it, and in true verrucosum fashion, it will probably have a huge tantrum, but hopefully it won't die. Also, when I first had this plant, humidity I also took very seriously and would always have a humidifier set up and have it running most of the time. I did find a while sort of down the track that it wasn't really benefiting the plant, and it was kind of a waste of time. If you can keep the humidity at least 60% or higher, and just make sure that the plant is always well watered, I think that is definitely enough for this plant. If you can provide a greenhouse or an IKEA cabinet, I think it will absolutely love that type of environment. However, I think it'll get really massive pretty quickly, so you'll probably find that it will outgrow that space. So a couple of things that I have learnt with this plant is, firstly, it hates anything changing with its environment, and this change could be a new spot that you're growing it in, or also propagating. Propagating is probably the biggest hate that it has, and I still find it really stressful to do, because even with doing all of the right steps, it still just looks really droopy and depressed for a few days before it perks back up again. I'm yet to find a propagation where it just looks happy and continues to grow. The roots on this plant are really fine, and it doesn't produce a lot of roots, so it makes it quite difficult to propagate. I think the best way to do this, and what has sort of worked for me, is growing it really far up a moss pole and doing a little bit less of a dramatic chop to your moss pole. So on this moss pole, I have 3 poles that are stacked together, and to make sure that the root supply for this plant is adequate, I'm only going to chop off 1 pole and continue to grow the 2. For other plants, I could probably do a little bit more of a drastic sort of chop and it would probably be fine, but this plant just, I don't think would survive that. If you wanted to do a smaller propagation, what I found works really well is air layering. And to do this, you would get a substrate of your choice, like sphagnum moss, and you would cover the aerial root area and then enclose in some plastic wrap. You can buy some pretty sort of neat contraptions online for air layering, but I find cling wrap is probably just an easy, cheap way to do this. Once you leave this for a few weeks, the aerial roots go absolutely crazy inside, and then you can take a single leaf cutting with having enough roots to sustain it. Another dislike with this plant is when a leaf is unfurling, just leave it alone. Don't look at it, don't mist it, don't give it a humidifier, don't try and unravel the leaves like I always do because I'm impatient. I have a really bad habit of unraveling leaves, but this plant cannot handle it when a new leaf is unfurling. It's got quite fragile leaves, and even though it may not look like you have done any damage at the time, as the leaf starts to mature and harden off, you will see that it has little blemishes on the leaf and it just doesn't look very nice. And that is how you care for a Philodendron Verrucosum. And I am going to chop and extend this moss pole, and if you are interested in seeing that, I will have a YouTube short that you can watch. I hope you enjoyed today's video, and I do post this plant a lot on my Instagram, so be sure to check that out. And if you haven't, I would also so appreciate if you could like this video and subscribe to my channel. And thank you again. I will see you in another video.